The dense jungles of Bougainville were alive with sounds no soldier could ever forget. The constant drip of water from leaves, the distant screech of unseen birds, and the lurking sense of danger in every shadow created a tension that gnawed at the nerves of every Marine stationed there. Among them was Gunnery Sergeant Tom Sullivan, a man whose reputation for ingenuity was about to become legend. On paper, the 20mm Oerlikon cannon he carried was strictly an anti-aircraft weapon, a tool meant to defend ships from diving planes over open water. The manuals, polished and authoritative, promised nothing more. Yet as Sullivan crouched in the mud, surveying the shattered remains of a PT boat and the chaotic landscape of fallen trees and thick undergrowth, he saw something the manuals didn't. He saw potential. The situation for the Marines on Bougainville was dire. Japanese forces were entrenched in the dense green, capable of moving unseen and striking suddenly. Patrols returned with stories of ambushes, and intelligence reports hinted at a Banzai attack brewing on the horizon. Sullivan understood that conventional weapons would only go so far in this environment. The Oerlikon, without the stabilizing platform of a ship, would recoil violently and was considered virtually useless against anything heavier than infantry. Yet to Sullivan, every challenge was a puzzle, and every puzzle had a solution. He imagined the cannon mounted on a tree stump, the perfect height for aiming, the heavy weight anchoring it against the recoil. It was audacious, even reckless, but in the chaos of war, audacity could become survival. Sullivan's first task was simple in concept, but daunting in execution: finding a suitable base. The jungle offered few stable options. Coconut stumps, rotting logs, and mud-soaked soil all presented challenges that would have made most men give up before they even began. Yet Sullivan refused to see obstacles. With a small team of fellow Marines, he began the laborious process of selecting and preparing a stump, stripping it of rot and reinforcing it with whatever scrap materials they could scavenge from the wrecked PT boat and abandoned supply crates. Every piece of wood, every nail and bolt was inspected, tested, and reconsidered. It was the kind of meticulous attention to detail that could mean life or death in the next engagement. While Sullivan worked, the other Marines watched with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. Officers shook their heads at the sight of a massive naval cannon mounted on a tree stump. "It won't fire without the deck of a ship beneath it," one said, laughter hidden behind his worry. "You'll rip the stump right out of the ground before you hit anything." Yet Sullivan ignored them, focusing only on the physics and the possibilities. He calculated angles, recoil, and firing positions in his mind, testing theories with small improvised movements and adjustments. The jungle was harsh and mistakes were costly, but every failure in testing only taught him how to refine his design. As days passed, Sullivan's vision began to take shape. The cannon, once a symbol of uselessness in the dense forest, now sat perched on the stump with a quiet menace. It looked almost ridiculous at first glance, absurdly out of place among the ferns and muddy water, but anyone who underestimated it would soon learn that appearances were deceiving. The positioning allowed for maximum field of fire across likely avenues of Japanese approach. Each angle, each adjustment was a calculated choice, born from the hours Sullivan spent walking the perimeter, observing enemy movements, and predicting how the enemy would attempt to breach their lines. The Stump Gun, as it would later be called, was more than a weapon. It was a statement of ingenuity, a challenge to conventional thinking, and a warning to anyone daring to approach. Sullivan's preparations went beyond the mechanical. He understood that the jungle was alive with sounds and movements that could give away his position. He camouflaged the stump with leaves, vines, and mud, ensuring it blended seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. Yet he left the cannon barrel exposed, just enough to fire without obstruction. It was a delicate balance between concealment and functionality, a lesson learned from countless patrols where the enemy had struck with surgical precision. He trained himself to anticipate the movement of both men and machines, to imagine the chaos of combat, and position the weapon to counter it effectively. The psychological aspect was just as important. Other Marines began to notice the subtle changes in Sullivan's demeanor, the quiet confidence that came from months of experience and exploration. He wasn't just building a weapon, he was building a symbol. In the face of constant threat, the men needed something to believe in, and Sullivan's stubborn determination offered that. Even as officers continued to mock the project, the murmurs among the enlisted men shifted from doubt to curiosity. What might this cannon do, mounted on a simple stump in the middle of the jungle? Could a single Marine really make a difference with it? As night fell and the dense fog and humidity wrapped the Marines in a thick, suffocating blanket, Sullivan sat beside his creation. He could hear distant rustlings, the soft crunch of leaves, and the occasional shout of a sentinel. He knew the Japanese were observing, probing, and planning. They might laugh if they could see the cannon perched on its stump, an incongruous sight in the midst of the swamp. But when the first enemy soldiers crossed into range, they would discover the harsh reality of Sullivan's invention. The Stump Gun was no longer just an idea. It was a promise of resistance, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of one Marine, and the beginning of a story that would be whispered and marveled at long after the jungle fell silent.
The process of turning an idea into a weapon was never going to be easy, especially in the thick, suffocating jungles of Bougainville. The first challenge Gunnery Sergeant Tom Sullivan faced was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice: how to mount a 1,000-pound naval cannon on a tree stump and make it usable in combat. The mud, the humidity, and the uneven terrain all conspired against him. The cannon, designed to sit firmly on the deck of a ship, was not meant to recoil on soft soil, and the notion of placing it on a coconut stump seemed, to everyone but Sullivan, preposterous. Yet he was undeterred. He approached the task not as a problem to be solved, but as a puzzle to be conquered, and he understood that in war, ingenuity often mattered more than manuals or regulations. Sullivan began by carefully selecting the stump that would become the foundation of his creation. It had to be solid, free of rot, and tall enough to give the cannon a commanding field of fire. He and a small team of Marines spent hours scouring the jungle, examining every felled tree, every broken coconut trunk, and every piece of debris left by previous skirmishes. Finally, they settled on a stump thick and sturdy enough to withstand the recoil, and yet small enough to be discreetly camouflaged among the surrounding foliage. It was a delicate balance, one that required both an engineer's eye and a soldier's intuition. Once the stump was chosen, the real work began. Sullivan improvised a mounting system using salvaged steel from a wrecked PT boat and any heavy-duty bolts they could find. Every piece was measured, cut, and reinforced, often under the oppressive feet of the tropical sun and the constant threat of enemy patrols. The cannon itself weighed more than a ton, and moving it through the jungle required ropes, pulleys, and sheer manpower. Each time they repositioned it, the men risked injury from slipping in the mud, from branches that snapped unexpectedly, or the cannon itself threatening to topple or bury itself in mud with each shot. Yet Sullivan insisted on perfection, adjusting the alignment by fractions of an inch, testing the stability of the stump repeatedly, and ensuring that it could withstand the tremendous kickback that would come when fired. Even as the mechanics were coming together, Sullivan faced another challenge: recoil. On a ship, the weight of the vessel and its anchoring systems absorbed most of the force, but on a stump in the jungle, the cannon threatened to topple or bury itself in mud with each shot. Sullivan studied the physics meticulously, experimenting with angles, placement, and reinforcement techniques. He drove stakes deep into the surrounding soil, bolstered the stump with extra logs, and even used sandbags where he could. The jungle resisted him at every turn. Roots twisted unexpectedly, the mud threatened to swallow his supports, and every miscalculation risked ruining the entire setup. Yet for every obstacle, Sullivan found a solution, often in the simplest materials the jungle offered. Throughout the process, other Marines watched in a mix of fascination and incredulity. Officers doubted that anything mounted on a stump could fire effectively, while some of the enlisted men wondered if Sullivan was wasting their time. Rumors circulated that the cannon would snap the stump in half or ricochet violently, injuring anyone nearby. Sullivan ignored them all. He understood that the world often judged innovation with skepticism before recognizing its genius. Instead of arguing, he demonstrated. With small test firings, careful adjustments, and relentless tinkering, he began to prove that what others deemed impossible was in fact achievable. Camouflage became another essential element of the stump gun. The jungle was a living, breathing enemy of concealment. Shadows shifted constantly, sunlight filtered through the canopy in unpredictable patterns, and animals rustled in ways that could easily reveal a hidden weapon. Sullivan meticulously covered the stump with mud, vines, and foliage, leaving only the barrel exposed enough to fire. He considered every approach the Japanese might take, every likely line of sight, and every natural obstruction that could obscure the weapon until it was too late for them to react. This was not merely hiding a gun, it was creating a trap, a silent predator waiting for the unsuspecting enemy to wander into range. Sullivan also had to adapt to the physical demands of firing the cannon. The Oerlikon was not designed to be mounted on unstable terrain, and its recoil could throw an unprepared operator off balance instantly. He spent long hours practicing, bracing himself against the stump, calculating how to absorb the force without losing aim, and timing the rate of fire to maximize impact while minimizing risk to himself. The training was grueling. Mud, sweat, and fatigue became constant companions, yet Sullivan's determination never wavered. Every practice round reinforced his understanding of the weapon and how to bend it to his will. While mechanical preparation was vital, Sullivan knew the stump gun's true power lay in its psychological impact. He was creating a weapon that would disrupt the enemy's confidence and reshape their expectations. The Japanese soldiers were trained to respect heavy artillery and feared open-air naval guns, yet they would never anticipate a single Marine wielding a massive cannon from the middle of the swamp. Sullivan understood that fear could be as powerful as any projectile, and he designed his setup to maximize that effect. A well-placed shot could slow a charge, scatter troops, and give his fellow Marines a crucial advantage. The day the stump gun was finally operational, it was more than just a weapon, it was a statement. It symbolized the merging of intellect and courage, the blending of necessity and creativity in the crucible of war. Sullivan had taken a piece of hardware everyone else dismissed, and through sheer willpower and relentless ingenuity, transformed it into a tool that could dictate the battlefield. The cannon, now perched on its reinforced stump, was ready not just to defend, but to dominate. It would soon be tested against the harshest conditions imaginable, the chaos of a Banzai charge, the jungle's unpredictable terrain, and the relentless determination of the Japanese army. By nightfall, Sullivan and his team stepped back and surveyed their work. The stump gun seemed almost alive, a hybrid of human intellect and raw power fire, quietly waiting among the ferns and mud. The hours of labor, the careful calculations, the endless trial and error had created something unique, something dangerous, something that blurred the line between imagination and reality. It was a testament to the idea that even in the most constrained circumstances, innovation could thrive. And as the distant sounds of enemy movement reached their ears, Sullivan knew that when the battle came, the weapon would speak for itself, and the skeptics would be silenced by the results.
The jungle around Bougainville had a rhythm all its own, and Gunnery Sergeant Tom Sullivan had learned to listen to it. Every rustle of leaves, every distant splash of water, even the softest shift in the wind became a signal. He understood the terrain better than anyone, and in the quiet moments before the enemy's arrival, he devised a plan that would transform a simple tree stump and a naval cannon into something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Sullivan called it his lighthouse strategy, a name inspired by the idea of a fixed guiding point of defense that could sweep the darkness with fire, illuminating threats and annihilating anyone who dared approach. The core principle was deceptively simple. Position the stump gun in a way that allowed maximum coverage of likely enemy approaches, then use its rapid-fire capability to channel Japanese movements into kill zones, funneling their attacks where the cannon could inflict the greatest damage. What made the strategy brilliant was that it was perfectly suited to the limitations of the weapon. The 20mm Oerlikon, while deadly, had limited traverse when mounted on a single stump. Sullivan turned this into an advantage, predicting how Japanese soldiers and even light armor would advance, and positioning his weapon so that its arcs of fire would intersect the most probable paths. Every angle was calculated, every line of sight memorized, and every natural obstruction used as camouflage or cover. Sullivan's understanding of enemy tactics was critical to the success of the lighthouse strategy. He had studied the patterns of Japanese infiltration, how they moved through the dense undergrowth, how they coordinated attacks, and how they reacted to defensive fire. Japanese soldiers were trained for stealth and surprise, using the jungle to their advantage, but they were vulnerable to controlled bursts of concentrated fire. Sullivan visualized their movements as lines converging toward a point, like tributaries feeding a river. He placed the stump gun at the center of this imaginary network, ready to intercept the flow and break it apart before it could overwhelm his position. The process of preparing for engagement went beyond setting angles and camouflage. Sullivan also created improvised range markers using small stakes, leaves, and rocks, enabling him to adjust fire quickly without exposing himself. He practiced the motions endlessly, simulating enemy approaches, adjusting for recoil, mud, and the unevenness of the jungle floor. Each test round brought new insights. A branch could deflect a shell, a mound of mud could absorb recoil unpredictably, and subtle variations in footing could throw off aim entirely. Yet with every challenge, Sullivan adapted. He learned to anticipate the behavior of the gun as much as he did the behavior of the enemy, turning his creation into an extension of his own instincts. The psychological component of the lighthouse strategy was just as important as the mechanical one. By establishing a fixed, dominant point of fire, Sullivan aimed to control not only the battlefield, but the minds of the approaching Japanese soldiers. The stump gun would be the unseen force that dictated movement, forcing attackers to hesitate, scatter, and ultimately stumble into prepared kill zones. In the chaos of a Banzai charge, hesitation could mean survival, but in Sullivan's design, hesitation would mean death. Even his fellow Marines began to notice a change in their own confidence. Standing near the stump gun, watching Sullivan work with methodical precision, they began to trust in his strategy. The weapon was no longer just a cannon on a stump. It was a beacon of hope, a symbol that they could survive what seemed like an inevitable disaster. The actual mechanics of the lighthouse strategy were equally inventive. Sullivan positioned the cannon to maximize overlapping fields of fire. He considered elevation, recoil, and reload speed, ensuring that successive bursts could cover every avenue of approach. He even calculated how enemy light tanks and armored vehicles would respond to the Oerlikon's high explosive shells, noting that while the gun could not destroy a Type 95 tank in a single hit, careful targeting of tracks, wheels, and exposed crew could disable it or force it to retreat. His calculations were precise. Every detail mattered in a jungle where a single misstep could be fatal. Timing was another critical element. Sullivan knew that the Banzai charge would not arrive as a single wave, but as a series of probing attacks, testing lines, and assessing weaknesses. His strategy relied on waiting for the enemy to commit, then striking with maximum firepower when they were most vulnerable. This required discipline and patience, two qualities Sullivan had honed through years of combat experience. He resisted the urge to fire prematurely, understanding that wasted rounds could compromise the effectiveness of the attack when it truly mattered. The jungle became a test of nerves, with every snapping twig and distant shout feeding tension, and Sullivan's calm focus turned the chaos into an advantage. Communication and coordination with the other Marines was also vital. Sullivan used hand signals, subtle movements, and pre-arranged cues to direct supporting fire, guide patrols, and ensure that his position was reinforced without exposing the stump gun's location. He essentially turned a single weapon into a command center, orchestrating the battle through observation, instinct, and careful control of firepower. Every element of the lighthouse strategy relied on anticipation, adaptability, and the disciplined application of deadly force. Even the natural environment played into the plan. Sullivan had learned to use the jungle itself as a force multiplier. Dense undergrowth created choke points, shallow water channels limited vehicle mobility, and fallen logs provided cover for Marines advancing under fire. By combining these elements with his fixed cannon, he created a scenario where the enemy would be trapped in a maze of natural and man-made obstacles, guided inexorably toward the killing field. The genius of the lighthouse strategy was that it didn't require perfect conditions. It turned the imperfections of the jungle into advantages, forcing the Japanese to fight on Sullivan's terms. By the time the first patrols of the Japanese army approached, Sullivan's preparations were complete. The stump gun was positioned with precision, reinforced against recoil, and camouflaged to perfection. Range markers and calculated arcs ensured that every shot would count, and the psychological weight of the weapon lent confidence to the Marines around him. Sullivan understood that this moment would test everything he had built: the engineering, the strategy, and the courage to stand alone against an advancing enemy. The lighthouse strategy was about to be validated in the most brutal way possible. And when the first enemy soldiers entered the kill zones, it became clear that Sullivan's intuition had been correct. The stump gun roared to life, a torrent of fire cutting through the approaching troops. Chaos erupted as the Japanese soldiers realized too late that they were not facing a conventional defensive line. The arcs of fire, carefully planned and executed, funneled the enemy into predictable paths, maximizing damage and disruption. Sullivan's calculations, his camouflage, his anticipation of enemy tactics, all of it worked in harmony. The weapon, once a piece of naval equipment deemed useless in the jungle, had become a force multiplier, a command post, and a psychological weapon all at once. The lighthouse strategy was not just about firepower, it was about control, foresight, and creativity under pressure. It demonstrated that a single Marine, armed with determination and ingenuity, could manipulate terrain, tactics, and technology to bend the battlefield to his will. By turning a static weapon into a dynamic defensive system, Sullivan had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that innovation often mattered more than raw numbers. When the smoke cleared and the initial waves of attack were repelled, the Marines understood something profound. In war, the greatest weapon is often the mind of the soldier who refuses to be constrained by convention.
The first signs of the Japanese Banzai charge were subtle, almost imperceptible. A distant rustle in the undergrowth, the faint crack of twigs snapping under hurried boots, the low murmur of voices carried through the humid Bougainville jungle. Gunnery Sergeant Tom Sullivan had been anticipating this moment for days. He knew the enemy's tactics, their willingness to charge en masse, and their reliance on shock and fear. Yet nothing could have fully prepared him or the Marines around him for the scale of what was about to hit. The stump gun, perched on its reinforced coconut base, waited like a predator, silent and lethal. As the first wave emerged from the dense foliage, Sullivan's heart remained calm, though every sense was on high alert. He could see the enemy advancing in loose formations, testing the defenses, probing for weak points. From his vantage point, he could measure distances, angle his weapon precisely, and anticipate their path.
He fired the first burst, the 20 Oerlikon spitting high explosive shells into the approaching soldiers. The air erupted with noise, the jungle echoing the thunderous impact of steel and explosives. Trees shuddered under near misses, mud flew in all directions, and the enemy hesitated, caught off guard by a weapon they dismissed as impractical. The initial chaos played perfectly into Sullivan's lighthouse strategy. The arcs of fire he had meticulously calculated forced the Japanese into predictable paths, funneled into areas where his rounds could do maximum damage. One by one, enemy soldiers fell, some from direct hits, others from the sheer force of the explosions throwing them off balance. Even light armored vehicles, which the Oerlikon could not fully destroy, were crippled when shells struck vulnerable tracks, wheels, or exposed crew compartments. Sullivan adjusted aim continuously, taking into account the recoil, the shifting mud, and the unpredictable behavior of both the terrain and the enemy. His movements were fluid, almost instinctive, as if the stump gun were an extension of his own body. The Banzai charge, renowned for its intensity and brutality, hit with renewed ferocity. A second wave came, shouting war cries that echoed eerily through the jungle canopy. Marines on the flanks opened fire with rifles and machine guns, but it was the stump gun that became the center of the defensive effort. With every burst, the cannon unleashed roughly 450 rounds per minute, a staggering rate of fire for a weapon mounted on a single stump. The noise was deafening, the recoil threatening to uproot the very foundation Sullivan had built, yet the reinforced stump held fast. Every shell that left the barrel was a testament to hours of preparation, ingenuity, and sheer determination. Sullivan's understanding of both the weapon and the terrain allowed him to dominate the battlefield. He anticipated where soldiers would duck, which paths the vehicles would take, and where cover could be exploited. The Japanese, trained to overwhelm with numbers and aggression, found themselves funneled into the killing zones Sullivan had created. Confusion rippled through their ranks as their coordinated charge broke under the relentless fire. It became clear that the stump gun, mounted on what had been once a simple coconut stump, was more than a weapon. It was a force that dictated the rhythm of combat. Despite the chaos, Sullivan remained focused. The heat, sweat, and smoke made visibility difficult, but he relied on his training and instincts. Each shot was deliberate, aimed to maximize disruption and prevent the enemy from regrouping. Marines nearby called out positions, signaling movement and targets, and Sullivan's responses were near instantaneous. The cannon's firepower, previously mocked by officers, was now the cornerstone of survival, turning what could have been a rout into a manageable defense. The jungle itself seemed to conspire in his favor. Mud slowed enemy movement, fallen logs redirected their paths, and the dense canopy muffled some of their movements, giving Sullivan precious seconds to react. The physical toll on Sullivan was immense. Firing the cannon repeatedly demanded extraordinary strength and endurance. Each burst sent vibrations up his arms and shoulders. Every round threatened to throw him off balance, and yet he remained steady. The mud beneath him threatened to shift. The recoil tried to topple the stump, and every shell could have catastrophic consequences if mismanaged. But Sullivan's preparation paid off. The reinforcements he had made to the base, the positioning he had calculated, and the constant adjustments allowed him to fire continuously, controlling the battlefield despite the overwhelming odds. By the midpoint of the assault, the Japanese forces were in disarray. Soldiers fell in clusters, their momentum broken, their charge scattered. Vehicles attempted to flank, but became bogged down in mud, trapped under the combined weight of the terrain and Sullivan's relentless fire. Each successive burst of the stump gun carved a deadly path through their lines, forcing survivors to retreat or face certain death. Marines who had once doubted the weapon now looked upon it with awe, recognizing that this improvised cannon was single-handedly reshaping the fight.
Sullivan's actions also had a psychological effect on the enemy. The roar of the cannon, the explosions that tore through the jungle, and the sudden appearance of devastating firepower from an unexpected source sapped morale. The Banzai charge, designed to terrify and overwhelm, now met resistance it could not anticipate. Fear replaced confidence, hesitation replaced aggression, and the precision of Sullivan's fire turned the momentum completely. The Stump Gun had not just survived the battlefield, it had conquered it. As the final waves of the attack faltered, Sullivan remained vigilant. He continued to fire intermittently, ensuring that no regrouping could occur. The jungle, once a place of uncertainty and threat, now bore the scars of his ingenuity. Fallen trees, churned mud, and the echoes of explosions marked the positions where the Stump Gun had exacted its devastating toll. Marines moved through the field, assessing the results, providing aid to the wounded, and recognizing the singular impact of what Sullivan had created. What had begun as a mocked experiment had become the centerpiece of one of the most effective defensive actions in the Pacific theater. The Stump Gun had proven its worth, but more importantly, Sullivan's actions had demonstrated a vital principle of war. Adaptation and ingenuity could overcome raw force. Against overwhelming numbers and hostile terrain, a single Marine, armed with determination, knowledge, and creativity, could change the outcome of an engagement. The cannon, bolted to a simple stump, had destroyed enemy momentum, inflicted massive casualties, and protected his fellow Marines in a way conventional weapons alone could not. By the end of the Banzai charge, it was clear that the Stump Gun was no longer just a tool. It was a legend in its own right, a symbol of innovation, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to be defeated.
When the smoke cleared from the chaos of the Banzai charge, the jungle of Bougainville was eerily quiet. The aftermath of combat revealed the tangible impact of one Marine's ingenuity. Gunnery Sergeant Tom Sullivan, exhausted but resolute, stood beside the Stump Gun, surveying the scene. Trees were splintered, mud churned into a chaotic landscape, and the bodies of enemy soldiers lay scattered in the paths he had predicted. What had started as a simple experiment, a cannon mounted on a coconut stump, had evolved into a symbol of resourcefulness and tactical brilliance. In that moment, it became clear that the story of the Stump Gun would not end with a single battle. It would echo far beyond the Pacific jungles. The immediate effect on Sullivan's fellow Marines was profound. For soldiers accustomed to relying on standard-issue weaponry and conventional strategies, the Stump Gun was a revelation. They had witnessed a weapon that, through careful planning and creative application, could hold back overwhelming enemy forces. Morale, often fragile in the unforgiving conditions of jungle warfare, surged. Men who had once doubted the practicality of the cannon now saw it as a protective force, a manifestation of human ingenuity that could tip the balance in their favor. Sullivan's leadership, combined with his ability to adapt, became a lesson in courage under pressure, inspiring those around him to think beyond manuals and expectations. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the tactical implications of the Stump Gun were significant. Military strategists later noted that Sullivan's improvisation illustrated a principle often overlooked in formal training. Adaptability could amplify the effectiveness of any weapon. The Oerlikon 20mm, dismissed as useless outside naval deployment, had been transformed into a defensive powerhouse capable of dictating enemy movements. Analysts studying Pacific campaigns recognized that the creative use of terrain, combined with an understanding of enemy tactics, could make even a single Marine's efforts decisive. Sullivan had demonstrated that in asymmetric situations, ingenuity often outweighed numbers or conventional firepower. Stories of the Stump Gun spread quickly, first among Marines on Bougainville, then throughout the Pacific theater. Accounts described the cannon as a force of nature, a single point of fire that shaped entire engagements.
Sullivan's methodical preparation, his anticipation of enemy movements, and his relentless focus on accuracy became examples in tactical discussions and training exercises. The stump gun was more than a weapon. It was a case study in adaptive combat, an enduring illustration of how creativity could redefine the limits of a battlefield. The psychological legacy was equally important. Japanese soldiers who had encountered Sullivan's weapon were forced to confront an unexpected reality. The enemy could innovate under pressure, and improvisation could be as deadly as traditional artillery. Among Allied forces, the story inspired a new level of confidence. It was a reminder that even in hostile, unpredictable environments, individual initiative and problem-solving could alter the course of events. The stump gun became a symbol of resilience, a demonstration that resourcefulness was as critical as courage in the fight for survival. Sullivan himself remained modest about his achievement. He did not seek recognition. His focus was on protecting his fellow Marines and ensuring mission success. Yet the impact of his actions was undeniable. Commanders began to incorporate lessons from the stump gun into training programs, emphasizing the importance of adapting weapons to specific terrain and situations. Manuals were amended to highlight improvisation, and the story of a single Marine turning a 20mm cannon on a stump into a decisive tool became an example in classrooms and briefings across the Pacific. Sullivan had created more than a weapon. He had created a doctrine of ingenuity. The jungle of Bougainville, once a hostile and incomprehensible expanse, had become a proving ground for human creativity under fire. Sullivan's careful observation, meticulous engineering, and unwavering courage transformed obstacles into advantages. Every element of the terrain, the mud, the trees, the uneven ground, was exploited to reinforce his strategy. By turning limitations into strengths, Sullivan demonstrated that the battlefield was as much a mental challenge as a physical one. The stump gun was a testament to this mindset, a physical manifestation of the idea that determination and intellect could overcome even the most daunting circumstances. Even decades later, the story of the stump gun resonated with soldiers, historians, and military enthusiasts alike. It illustrated timeless principles that preparation, adaptability, and creative problem-solving could redefine what was possible in combat, that a single individual armed with knowledge and initiative could influence the course of an entire engagement, and that courage was inseparable from imagination in the harsh realities of war. Sullivan's actions left a legacy not measured only in the damage inflicted or lives saved, but in the lessons that would inform military thinking for generations. As Sullivan finally set down the cannon and took a breath, the significance of what he had achieved became clear. The stump gun was more than a clever adaptation. It was a symbol of human ingenuity facing overwhelming odds. It proved that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield was not the gun itself, but the mind of the soldier willing to challenge convention. Bougainville would remain a testament to that principle, and the story of the stump gun would endure, a reminder that innovation, courage, and determination could turn even the simplest tools into instruments of legend.